By the spring of 1453, the Roman Empire, a state that once dominated the known world, had retreated to a single point on the map. This was Constantinople, a city of ghosts. Its population had collapsed from nearly 1 million at its peak to just 50,000, defended by a garrison of only 7,000 men. Yet for over 1,000 years, those 7,000 men were all the city needed. Protection came from the Theodosian walls, a 3-layered system of stone and deep moats that had turned away every invader, from the Huns to the first Arab caliphates. To the medieval world, these defenses were considered a physical certainty. That certainty was about to be tested by Sultan Mehmed II. At just 19 years old, he arrived at the gates with an army of 80,000 Ottoman troops, determined to end the Roman legacy once and for all. For Mehmed, capturing Constantinople was a religious and political necessity. Islamic tradition had prophesied that a great leader would claim this red apple of the West, and the young sultan believed his reign depended on fulfilling that ancient ambition. But numbers alone couldn't scale those walls. To enter the city, Mehmed would have to find a way to break the very stones that had defined the limits of conquest for 10 centuries. Mehmed's first challenge was the Western Land Wall, a barrier too thick for traditional rams. He looked for a solution in modern chemistry, hiring a Hungarian engineer named Orban to cast the largest bronze weapons the world had ever seen. The result was Byzantica, a 27-foot supercannon designed to fire stone projectiles weighing 1,500 pounds. It was a weapon of immense scale, requiring 60 oxen just to move it into position. When these stones hit the Theodosian walls, the impact was unlike anything the defenders had experienced. The ground shook as ancient masonry, walls that had stood for a millennium, shattered into dust under the weight of the Ottoman bombardment. But the technology was unstable. The heat generated by the black powder was so intense that the guns risked exploding, forcing the Ottoman crews to wait 3 hours between shots just to let the bronze cool. This delay gave the defenders a window. Led by the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, the Romans spent those 3-hour gaps frantically filling the breaches with earth, barrels, and timber, materials that actually absorbed the shock of the next cannonball better than the original stone. The siege turned into a grueling race. Mehmed would blast a hole in the defenses, and by the time his guns cooled, Giustiniani's men would have rebuilt it. Mehmed realized he couldn't win by hitting the same spot. He needed to force the Romans to defend their much weaker seawalls to the north, effectively splitting their 7,000 men across miles of new territory. The problem was geography. The Golden Horn Inlet, the only way to reach those seawalls, was sealed shut by a massive iron chain. Behind that chain, the Roman fleet sat in safety, blocking the Ottoman navy. Mehmed's response defied the landscape. He ordered a wooden road built over the steep forested hills of Galata, bypassing the chain entirely by going over the land. Throughout the night of April 21st, thousands of men and oxen dragged dozens of Ottoman warships over the mountain on greased logs. By morning, the defenders on the walls looked down to see an enemy fleet sailing in a harbor they thought was physically inaccessible. The movement forced the Romans into a crisis. To guard this new front, Constantine had to pull troops away from the western gates, leaving the primary land walls dangerously thin. As the naval pressure mounted, the Ottomans moved the battle underground. Serbian sappers were brought in to dig beneath the walls, hoping to collapse the foundations. The Romans countered with John Grant, a Scottish engineer who used water-filled barrels to detect the subtle vibrations of digging. When the water rippled, Grant knew exactly where the Ottoman sappers were working. Grant's teams dug their own counter-tunnels, breaking into the Ottoman shafts to flood them or burn the attackers with Greek fire. The subterranean war was a brutal stalemate, but time was on Mehmed's side. By late May, the Ottoman camp was also nearing a breaking point. 50 days of failure had drained their supplies and morale, and Mehmed's advisors were openly pushing for a retreat before a European relief fleet could arrive. Mehmed decided on one final, desperate gamble. He would throw every man he had left at the city in a single coordinated assault. It was his last chance to take the capital, or face the ruin of his reign. In the early hours of May 29th, the final assault began. Mehmet launched wave after wave of infantry against the walls, eventually sending in his elite janissaries to face the exhausted defenders at the Mesotikion. The defense finally buckled under a series of rapid disasters. Giustiniani, the man who had held the walls together for weeks, was severely wounded and carried from the field. In the resulting confusion, a small group of Ottoman soldiers discovered a minor side door, the Kerkaporta Gate, had been left unlocked. As Ottoman standards began appearing atop the towers, the Roman defense collapsed into a panic. Emperor Constantine XI, realizing the city was lost, reportedly cast off his imperial regalia and charged into the melee on foot. He was never seen again. When Mehmed finally entered the city, he rode directly to the Hagia Sophia. He ended the looting and ordered the cathedral converted into a mosque, claiming the title of Roman Caesar and making the city the new seat of the Ottoman Empire. The fall of Constantinople ended a state that had endured for 2,000 years. While the walls had physically withstood the heaviest stones ever thrown at them, the arrival of the cannon had changed the nature of the threat. The Middle Ages were over. The era of the fortress was beginning to give way to the era of gunpowder. For over a millennium, the ancient walls of Constantinople held back every invading force that reached its gates. Goths, Huns, Arabs, and the Kievan Rus all threw their armies at this stonework and failed. This cross-section illustrates exactly why the city was considered invincible. Any attacking army had to cross a 60-foot deep moat, scale a fortified middle wall under heavy fire, and then somehow breach a massive inner wall that towered over the battlefield. Approaching by water offered no easy alternative. The defenders had stretched a massive, floating iron chain entirely across the Golden Horn Harbor, physically barricading enemy ships from entering the coastal waters. By the spring of 1453, the Roman Empire behind those walls was bleeding out. Decimated by plagues and centuries of civil war, the metropolis of 500,000 people had dwindled to a few walled neighborhoods separated by empty fields, defended by a skeleton crew of only 7,000 soldiers. Toppling these walls would bridge the Ottoman territories in Europe and Asia, turning a regional sultanate into the administrative successor of the Roman Empire. In 1453, 19-year-old Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II arrived at those gates with an army of nearly 100,000 men. He knew a standard infantry charge against the Theodosian defenses was a mathematical impossibility. He hired a Hungarian engineer named Orban to cast the basilica, a massive bronze bombard pushing the absolute limits of contemporary metallurgy. Deploying this artillery piece was a logistical nightmare. It required a team of 60 oxen to drag it 150 miles from the Ottoman foundry in Edirne all the way to the front lines. Once in position, the gun hurled 600-pound stone projectiles directly into the city's ancient stonework, steadily pulverizing defenses that had stood since antiquity. But the weapon had a critical flaw. It took a full 3 hours to reload and frequently cracked under extreme heat. During those long delays, the Roman defenders simply filled the breaches with timber and dirt, effectively rebuilding the wall between volleys. Brute force alone could not solve the siege. To break the city, Mehmed had to find ways around the stone. On this map of the Golden Horn, the primary obstacle is the thick iron chain barring Ottoman ships from the northern seawalls. Mehmed engineered an audacious workaround, constructing a pathway of greased logs straight up the hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata. Under the cover of darkness, thousands of soldiers and oxen manually dragged 70 warships up the incline, over the landmass, and down into the harbor behind the chain. The defenders awoke to find a hostile fleet sitting squarely inside their secure waters. Below ground, Mehmed deployed Serbian sappers to dig a network of tunnels directly beneath the city gates, intending to pack them with gunpowder and collapse the fortifications from the bottom up. The defenders answered with their own engineering trick. A Scottish mercenary named Johannes Grant placed bowls of water on the ground. By watching for ripples on the surface, he mapped the underground digging vibrations, dug counter-tunnels, and flooded the Ottoman sappers with incendiary Greek fire. Mehmed's strategy forced the Romans to defend the crumbling land walls, the harbor, and the earth beneath them all at once, stretching the tiny garrison to its limit. On the 53rd day of the siege, Mehmed launched an all-or-nothing frontal assault. He threw his forces against the walls in 3 continuous waves. The Roman line held until their most effective tactical leader, a Genoese mercenary commander, took a bullet to the chest. As his men carried him off the battlefield, panic spread through the exhausted ranks, and the primary defensive line began to buckle. Then, a fatal human error doomed the city. A small sally port on the outer wall had been accidentally left unlocked after a Roman counterattack, allowing a detachment of Ottoman troops to slip right past the barricades. Seeing enemy standards rising above the walls, Emperor Constantine stripped off his purple imperial regalia, drew his sword, and charged headfirst into the advancing Janissaries. He was never seen again. The millennium of defense ended through constant artillery stress, total human exhaustion, and a single gate left ajar. As Ottoman troops flooded the streets, Mehmed rode into the city and quickly rescinded his orders for a 3-day sack, choosing to preserve the infrastructure of his grand prize. He immediately declared himself Kaiser-i-Rum, the Caesar of Rome. By claiming the imperial title, Mehmed positioned his rising state as the direct continuation of the ancient Roman lineage. To cement this transition, the city's greatest architectural triumph, the Hagia Sophia, was converted from an Orthodox Christian cathedral into a grand Islamic mosque. The fall of the city signaled that fixed fortifications were no longer a guarantee of survival against gunpowder, ending the Roman lineage and establishing the Ottomans as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean.